things started on this topic in my last video, so if you missed that, be sure to go watch it after you watch this one, but now today we're finishing things off with part 2. What we're doing is going through every single NBA team, and we're identifying the biggest mistake that they made this offseason. Some teams made catastrophic mistakes, some teams just made a small blunder, and most teams' mistakes fall somewhere in between. Last video we went through the teams in the Eastern Conference, so that means in this video we're now finishing up by going through the teams in the Western Conference. Before we start though, it turns out a good amount of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but I'd also very much appreciate it. Now with that being said, let's begin. Going in alphabetical order, we'll start with the Dallas Mavericks, and their biggest mistake this offseason was allowing Derrick Jones Jr. to walk in free agency. All in all, the Mavericks had a very strong offseason, coming off of a trip to the NBA Finals, but losing Derrick Jones Jr. and his versatile defense that played a big role during last season's run is going to sting at least a little bit. The Clippers ended up snagging him for about $10 million per year on his new contract, so his price tag wasn't even necessarily out of the Mavericks' reach. Next is the Denver Nuggets, and their biggest mistake this offseason is expecting Russell Westbrook to fill all of their holes. In back-to-back offseasons, the Nuggets have lost key contributors from their championship-winning squad in Bruce Brown last offseason, and now Kentavious Caldwell-Pope this offseason. And Russell Westbrook is the only reinforcement that the team has brought in to replace them. Westbrook is not the defender that either of those two players are, and at this point in his career, his skill set clashes with the likes of Nikola Jokic and Jamal Murray as a very ball-dominant player, so the fit is questionable, and the Nuggets are putting too much stock in him being what he is not at this age. Next is the Golden State Warriors, and their biggest mistake this offseason was being too conservative. The Warriors' glory days rival any peak the NBA has ever seen, so they do know what it takes to get to the mountaintop, which is why it's so surprising to see them seemingly content with wasting away the final few years of Steph Curry's prime. Allowing Klay Thompson to leave instead of paying him big money as an extension may have been the right move, but the players that they brought in to replace Klay and Chris Paul, who they waived, being of course DeAnthony Melton, Buddy Hield, and Kyle Anderson, are just not pieces that elevate a team to the status of contender. Next is the Houston Rockets, and their biggest mistake this summer was relying too heavily on player development being enough. The Rockets have a lot of promising young talent budding in their lineup, but as they hope to continue progressing up the standings in a tough Western Conference, the only notable newcomer to their rotation will be rookie Reed Sheppard. They're relying on their talent developing naturally together, which is definitely a good thing for a long-term plan, but in the immediate future, they're probably in for a similar finish as last season. Next is the Los Angeles Clippers, and their biggest mistake from the offseason was letting Paul George walk in free agency. The Clippers got hung up on the amount of years that they wanted to give George in their negotiations, and ultimately it cost them his services. Kawhi Leonard and James Harden are still on the team, but both continue to trend downwards as they age, and the team signing Nicholas Batum and Derrick Jones Jr. to replace Paul George is not enough to keep them afloat in a loaded conference, so now they're just desperately clinging to the falsehood of contention for a few more seasons. Next is the Los Angeles Lakers, and their biggest mistake this offseason was choosing to run it back with what they have. The Lakers have been in the play-in tournament in back-to-back seasons, which is just not good enough for a team led by LeBron James and Anthony Davis. The supporting cast is as mediocre as it gets, and they have trade assets they could have dangled in front of teams for pieces that could help them in the immediate future, but the Lakers instead chose to bring back largely the same exact team from last year with the addition of rookies Dalton Knecht and Bronny James, which is not enough of a boost to take them seriously. Next is the Memphis Grizzlies, and their biggest mistake this offseason was drafting Zach Edey 9th overall in the draft. This may be a controversial selection for their mistake, but I have never been that big of a believer in Edey being lottery caliber talent, and for most of the pre-draft process, Edey also was viewed as a late first-round pick at best, so for them to reach for him in the top 10 when he's a slow-footed center who needs way too many post-up touches in the modern NBA to be utilized properly has disaster written all over it. Next is the Minnesota Timberwolves, and their biggest mistake this offseason was only improving via youth. I'm a big fan of what the Timberwolves did in the draft this year, coming away with both Rob Dillingham and Terrence Shannon in the first round, but those two are the only real newcomers to the team this year besides an old shell of Joe Ingles. The Wolves are one of the best teams in the Western Conference with a lot of their money already tied up in the core that they have, but it still feels as though banking on rookies alone to elevate your game is a risky gamble. Next is the New Orleans Pelicans, and their biggest mistake this summer was ignoring the center position. Training camp is starting very soon, and right now, the only options the Pelicans have to start at center are rookie Yves Missy and career backup Daniel Tice. They allowed Jonas Valanciunas to leave in free agency, and then seemingly forgot that they had to find a viable replacement at one of the most important positions on the court. Next is the Oklahoma City Thunder, and their biggest mistake this offseason was continuing to hold all of their trade chips instead of unloading them in a big move. The Thunder have all of the momentum in the world, a talented young core under contract for a while, a ton of money to spend, and endless draft picks to dangle in trades. Now is as good of a time as ever for them to swing big and try to solidify themselves as the cream of the crop in the West, but instead, they're still focusing on the slow grind as time passes by. Next is the Phoenix Suns, and their biggest mistake this offseason was just accepting defeat on their current situation. By this I mean that they took a gamble last year by trading for Bradley Beal, and after being swept in the first round of the playoffs, they're left with few avenues towards improvement because of how much their payroll is taken up by their big three of Beal, Kevin Durant, and Devin Booker. In an ideal world, they sought ways to trade Beal again to get him and his monstrous contract off of their books, but instead they made a few moves around the edges, which were admittedly good given the circumstances, but the point remains. Next is the Portland Trail Blazers, and their biggest mistake this offseason was continuing to hold on to Jeremy Grant. Jeremy Grant is quickly becoming one of the most underrated players in the whole league because he's quietly producing at a pretty high level as an efficient two-way wing player that scores over 20 points per game on a Portland team now focused on rebuilding for the future. At 30 years old, Grant is not realistically a part of the Blazers' timeline, so with his value still being so high, they absolutely should have tried to trade him for more assets that could help them down the line. Next is the Sacramento Kings, and their biggest mistake this summer was ignoring the defensive end from their front court. The Kings made a big splash by bringing in DeMar DeRozan to boost their scoring output, but in the process have made a big hole for themselves on the defensive end. Keegan Murray does hold his own, but the team's front court has had defensive issues for a while now, and DeRozan is not a defensive upgrade by any means. Next is the San Antonio Spurs, and their biggest mistake this summer was settling for a short-term answer at point guard instead of seeking out a permanent solution. I will say that I believe the addition of Chris Paul will help Victor Wembanyama's development a ton because he is still an outstanding passer of the basketball and will feed him plenty of easy looks inside, but Paul is also 39 years old, on a one-year contract, and on the verge of retiring. Wembanyama needs a talented point guard to develop chemistry with as soon as possible, and this is just a temporary answer to that need. And finally, the last team up is the Utah Jazz, and their biggest mistake was holding on to John Collins. The Jazz traded for John Collins last season, hoping to do a similar rejuvenation to his career that they did to Lauri Markkanen as well, but it just did not work out that way, and ironically enough, his fit alongside Lauri Markkanen, who the team also just paid a max contract to, is pretty clunky. Collins is still a good player, but he's an awkward fit and not a part of the team's long-term outlook, so it would have been best to cut their losses with him to focus on other players that they have in their rotation that are young and need more minutes. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below what you think these teams messed up on this summer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.